Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. It's been a while since our last episode. I think we last spoke to you in late August when we had Johnny Jager on the show. But we're looking to get back to a more regular schedule here with the start of practice today, the start of the regular season in college basketball in 6 weeks from today, actually. And yesterday at Simon Scott Assembly Hall, Indiana held its annual media day for the 2021-22 season. If you check out inside the hall, of course, we've had coverage of everything. Our two student reporters, Tyler Tachman and Grace Ybarra, were both on hand for yesterday's festivities in person. I'm sure they were happy to be back and actually looking somebody face to face rather than over Zoom like what we're doing now. But I wanted to have both of you guys on. Officially, Tyler, you've been on the show before, but Grace, welcome. Your first appearance on Podcast on the Brink. We'll try to have you on periodically throughout the season. But Tyler, we'll start with you. You wrote something, obviously, on Inside the Hall, just about your thoughts on yesterday's media day. But big picture, anything that stood out to you yesterday from media day, or that you took away that maybe you learned that you didn't know going in?
Yeah, the big thing that I've been kind of like going over in my head about is how kind of high the expectations have seemed to got so quickly. And I don't think that it's because in no way does anyone expect Indiana to go to the Final Four or even probably Elite Eight or anything like that in year one of Mike Woodson's tenure. But it's just kind of interesting to see the buildup from when he was hired to now, how quickly the excitement has inflated. And I was thinking, kind of comparing it in some fashion to Indiana football, because I feel like the expectations maybe could be too high already for Indiana, and the excitement could maybe not be. I mean, obviously you don't want to have no excitement in a season, but maybe all the hype around this season might be a little bit too much for Mike Woodson's, first year in his tenure, because you're looking at a team that didn't even make the NCAA tournament. They haven't made it in 5 years. And I think it's great that there's a lot of excitement. I think it's great that everyone, just the feeling around the program has done a complete 180 since February. But I'm a little bit worried that if Indiana loses to Syracuse, loses to St. John's, all of a sudden, the wheels might start falling off, pretty quickly in terms of the fan support. I don't know if that's true, but I think just the dynamic and how quickly things have turned just kind of opened my eyes a little bit. I don't know if it's a good thing one way or another, but that's just something that has kind of stood out to me early on.
Yeah, we can get into expectations a little bit later in the show. I actually had that kind of on my notes of things I wanted to talk to you about, because there's been already some preseason predictions. I had my offseason power rankings, which Indiana fans did not like, because I had Indiana picked 8th in the Big Ten. We can talk about that a little bit maybe later in the show with Big Ten Media Day coming up. But Grace, what if anything did you learn yesterday? I feel like sometimes these media days, we come out of them and there's one or two themes that kind of get talked about, and then that's all we write about and talk about leading into the season. Then when the actual season tips off, all that's out the window when the games start. And, we talk about, this 4-out, 1-in offense that Mike Woodson's talked about a lot in the preseason. Trayce Jackson-Davis shooting 3-pointers potentially. We'll see if that actually happens. But I'm just curious from your perspective. You've been around IU athletics. You covered the team last year for the IDS. What, if anything, did you learn yesterday from media day, or anything kind of stood out to you as maybe something big picture that we can actually look forward to in regards to the season?
I think one of the biggest themes that stood out to me yesterday was kind of tying back to history and tradition. Covering the team last year, I don't know. I mean, Tyler, you can agree with me on this. I don't know if history and tradition and everything that this program has built over the years is something that was ever really an emphasis with Archie Miller's teams. And I think having Mike Woodson back, he's put so much of an emphasis on that. And one of the little things I think that was repeated over and over again, not just by Coach Woodson in the beginning, but by several players after, is whenever they go to break after practice and they're in that huddle, he makes them look at the Big Ten banners first and then at the national title banners and then tell them that's what they're working toward. And I don't know if that sentiment has ever been something that this program, at least within the last few years, last decade, has really pushed for. And tying back to the history and tradition, I know someone asked a question about Bob Knight yesterday and how much Coach Woodson is instilling what Knight taught him in his coaching. And he said, that's Knight's work up there. I want my own work to be up there. And it's really interesting because we talk about those banners all the time, but I don't think last year, the years prior, that those banners were ever really a focus or motivation. And to see the way in which Coach Woodson is using those with his program is really interesting.
Yeah, the program in general has kind of done a complete turn in recent years since Knight came back for that Purdue game in 2020. It was almost like, as a media member, I've been covering the team since 2007, but been going to games since 2010 or 11. And you never, going back to like the early Crean years or even Archie's tenure, really, you never really asked about Bob Knight at all. It wasn't something that was talked about. He didn't have any interest in associating himself with the program for obvious reasons. And now that he's come back, and obviously Mike Woodson played for him, and the whole Indiana family is kind of back behind the program, it's definitely a change in the feeling, just in terms of embracing the tradition. I agree with you. Archie Miller, in some ways, early on, he talked about wanting to really embrace tradition and bring back former players, but a lot of it ended up being really lip service and nothing really materialized. It's one thing to talk about it, but to actually do it and bring guys back is a totally different story. I think Mike Woodson's going to be able to do that. One of the things I wanted to get both of your opinions on, it's something I've been thinking about a lot in the preseason, is Indiana's point guard situation. Because on one hand, you have a guy coming back in Rob Fennessy, who started most of his IU career. He's obviously coming back in order to play a role, a significant role, and it probably is his expectation. We don't know exactly if he's going to start, if he's going to come off the bench. In the Bahamas, he was off the bench, and they bring in Xavier Johnson and then Khristian Lander, a 5-star recruit. You got 3 different guys who I think all in their mind believe they should play some type of role. But when it comes down to it, I don't know how much you can play all 3. Maybe you play them together a little bit. Grace, just you watched the team last year. Khristian Lander, to me, is interesting going into the season because he really should be a freshman if he had not reclassified. But we really didn't see anything out of him last year that suggests that he was ready to contribute in any meaningful way. What are your expectations for him, if any, going into the season? And do you foresee a scenario where he's able to carve out any meaningful role for himself in his second season in Bloomington?
Yeah, I mean, thinking back to watching him play last season, it was really interesting because often you'd forget that he was supposed to be a senior in high school at that point. And I think it was something that was brought up yesterday with Media Day, asking about like, okay, now you're in what would be your true freshman year, but you're in your second year. And I don't know, especially with the competition and having Xavier and Rob as options, I don't foresee any situation in which Khristian's going to get a meaningful position, at least in meaningful minutes within games. I think we saw a lot of areas of growth. I'm not sure how that's worked over the offseason, but just with turnovers, I feel like there would be so many situations where he'd do something on the offensive end, throw the ball away, try to get back on defense and foul. There were just so many situations like that where it wasn't just one mistake, but it was a few mistakes in tandem, and then that ended up just putting him in a bad spot. So I think he has a lot to learn, and that's not saying he's not talented because clearly he is. He's just really young. And I think being around Xavier and Rob will help him a lot, but with the competition that there is, I don't see him carving out a meaningful role.
Or do you see him being patient enough to accept that maybe he's not going to be the guy this year? Because when you're a 5-star recruit, you're coming into a place and you think, Archie Miller got him to classify up to get him to college earlier to play a role. So now he's coming into his second season. You were in the Bahamas. You saw those games. I looked at the box scores. I watched the video. he barely played in those games. And those were exhibition games that didn't really mean anything. That's an opportunity to kind of get everybody on your team minutes, and he barely played. So I'm just curious, do you think he's going to be patient, and do you think he's going to be willing to kind of accept a lesser role? To me, it's one of the more fascinating storylines, at least entering the season, because I agree with Grace. I don't see a path for him to take minutes from Rob Fennessy or Xavier Johnson.
I think that the promising part to whether you look at is he going to stay around or not is that he came back this season. He was in the transfer portal. He could have left. The guy he was recruited by, Archie Miller, is gone, and no prior relationship to Mike Woodson, and he decided to stick around. So I think if you're looking at it from that angle, that's a promising sign that he is invested in Indiana. And I think he said when he came back, he was like, he wanted to kind of be the building blocks of bringing the program back, which is kind of what Trayce has been the ringleader for when he decided to come back as well. But when you look at the point guard position, I think that it has the potential to be possibly Indiana's biggest strength or also biggest weakness, because Xavier Johnson, I was really impressed by him in the Bahamas. He looked like kind of the guy that Indiana hasn't had the last few years that they haven't had since Yogi Ferrell, a guy that's been able to command the court, that's been able to, you just hand him the ball, if nothing else, and he can make plays. He was extremely shifty, extremely elusive. But Alex, I know you've had kind of your hesitations with him, knowing that at Pitt, he had some turnover issues. He had some issues fouling, technical fouls, kind of letting his temper get the best of him, which he said he is trying to work on. And then you have Rob Fennessy, who's kind of just been a perplexing player in Indiana throughout his time here, and that he looked like a guy that could be an all Big Ten guard as a freshman. Then he kind of had his injuries, and last season his confidence plummeted. And this season he's been reading that the Killer Mindset, I can't remember the full name, but by Dave Anderson, he said that's helped him a lot mentally. He also said he's been using the Calm app, and I use the Calm app too. And it's like, that's very helpful just in terms of like centering yourself and centering your thoughts, and not even regarding basketball, but just like trying to be more calm, I guess, as the app says. But that's certainly a big help. And I guess the one last thing I'll add about Khristian Lander is I was kind of intrigued by how the fan base embraced him last season, because I feel like through the first 5 games, it was all frustration. Everyone was like, well, this is a 5-star point guard, and he looks totally out of sorts. Like he doesn't really belong at the college game. But it seemed like after those first couple of games, people realized that like they could kind of embrace the idea of watching him learn and watching a kid that shouldn't have even been in college kind of like develop. So I just kind of found that interesting, how like it just seemed like the fan base's sentiment towards him, how they viewed him, changed pretty quickly when they realized that he wasn't going to be a guy that was going to immediately come in and be someone that impacts the game in multiple ways. And I mean, I think that potential is still there, and you can play 2 guys at the same time. But if there's one guy that you look at that's kind of being behind the 8 ball right now, it would probably be him.
Trayce Jackson-Davis obviously put up really good numbers last year, but Indiana didn't win very many games, and he's on all these preseason lists. He's on, he's I think a preseason first team All-American by somebody. I know Blue Ribbon came out earlier this week. He was second team preseason All-American. We've heard a lot, as I mentioned earlier, about him potentially shooting jump shots, which I don't know how much that's actually going to happen. It's something that we've talked about all offseason, but when the games actually start being played, in my opinion, he's going to be within 5 to 7 feet of the basket, kind of playing to his strengths, doing what he does, which is scoring the paint. But, when I think about Trayce this season, like tangible ways that we can measure whether or not he's improved, the first thing that comes to mind to me is nothing like shooting threes or his free throw percentage or his stats. It's whether or not he can be the best player on a winning team, which is something he hasn't done yet. Both of you, Tyler, you can start, and then Grace, if you have anything to add. What are you looking for out of Trayce in his 3rd season? What do you look at as things that he can actually do to show that he's improved? Because it's hard to really do much better than 19-9 on a Big Ten team, realistically. So my argument is, if he wants to show people he's a better player, he needs to lead Indiana to more wins. Would agree with that? And anything else what else do you think maybe he can show that he's better at?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I'll add to that, if Indiana has the success that a lot of people are hoping, those numbers might go down because he shouldn't have to do as much. I mean, last year he had to carry so much of that load, and there was no one else, I would say, on a game in and a game out basis that you could rely on. So much of that burden fell on him. And I think it's hard to see his numbers, even with the hype coming back, increasing a lot, just because if the guys around him are doing their job, he shouldn't have to take the load that he did last season. But from an intangible perspective, there was a lot of times last year where he admitted it too, that he was kind of getting in his own head. There was times where he was missing little 2-footers, little putbacks. And I think making sure that, he is maybe not overthinking things, and that's a lot easier said than done. But I think kind of trying to get on track as well as he can in that regard, and also just becoming, I think, an alpha dog. Indiana really did not have an alpha dog last season. I think that him and maybe Miller Kopp, Xavier Johnson, I think they all have the potential to be that, and maybe even Tamar Bates, even as a freshman. But Indiana didn't really have that last season. And Trayce said in the Bahamas that was one of the biggest things that he felt like he has changed since he was a freshman, is that he's more willing to call people out and more willing to be that leader. And I think along with Mike Woodson, he's kind of been the symbolic leader of what this Indiana kind of program trying to bring it back is. And so for him to do that, he kind of has to maybe be more demonstrative. And because I know that was kind of a critique of him, of that sometimes he didn't show the most emotion, but maybe he has to be someone that shows more emotion, that's going to get in guys' face, that's going to demand the most out of them.
I agree with what Tyler has to say. I think what I was going to say from an intangible perspective is he needs to be a leader, and that's not going to be something you can quantify other than how they're acting on the court. And the way that Trayce has talked about this team in general off the court is how much fun they're having and how good of a relationship they have. And they've talked about how they're all great friends off the court. So if Trayce can kind of be the catalyst in carrying that over on the floor and helping keep that good friendship, but also, like you said, Tyler, call people out, be that alpha dog on the floor. And then from a tangible perspective, I think it drove me crazy every time last year that he would get an and one called and he couldn't convert at the free throw line. So, I mean, very small things. And we said free throw percentage, and that's obviously something that if he's working on his shot, hopefully goes up too. But just being able to lead by example and get those small little things tightened up so that he can be that leader on the floor.
So I think you both brought up interesting points there. Tyler, when you talked about kind of him having more help on the roster, Grace, I'll go to you first on this, and Tyler, you can chime in. Like, when you look at this roster beyond Trayce, who do you think are one or two guys that are most important to this team to have the success to meet those expectations that everybody's talking about in the preseason?
I think it comes from different areas. I think Trayce is your vet guy. Obviously, he's in his third year, but All-American. You need that kind of leadership, someone that's been around this program for 2 years. And then Tyler mentioned Miller Kopp. I think Miller Kopp's going to be instrumental in not only leadership, but he's a guy that IU hasn't had in a while. Someone that can hopefully knock down those shots. Don't want to jinx anything, but he did it a lot last year against IU. So they need someone that can do that. And he's also really proven to be a good leader and good role model off the court and on the court. So they need someone like that. And that's that transfer perspective. He's not someone that's been around IU, but he's someone that's coming in and making IU his home. And then I think, like you said, we can expect some of that alpha dog from Tamar. And that's going to be the young perspective on the team, to show that you don't have to be around this program the whole time. You can come into it. You can be, I don't know how old he is, maybe 18, 19, and show out. So I think if you get that different kind of leadership throughout the different facets of the people on the team, that's going to be really huge, because then it's not just one person running the show. And I know Trayce doesn't want to be the only person running the show and the only person leading, so that'll be really helpful for them.
I'll start with Xavier Johnson, and we've talked about him, but just given kind of Indiana's point guard struggles the last few years, I think he can be instrumental for them. But besides that, I'll point to two guys that can be big role players, Jordan Geronimo coming off the bench and Parker Stewart. And I picked those two guys for the reason that being in the Bahamas, I think they were, if not the most energetic guys that brought the most energy, they were up there as two of the guys that brought the most. And they were making plays that simply like Indiana just didn't have last year. There were so many times we saw Indiana can't come up with loose balls. That was the biggest thing, I think, in the loss at Illinois. There was just kind of 50-50 balls and Indiana couldn't pick them up. And I know a criticism of Indiana last year was not having enough energy, not seeming like, they were maybe giving it 100% all they had. Like there was kind of just a noticeable lack of like charisma and energy on the court. And I think that Geronimo and Parker Stewart, two guys that in the Bahamas really stood out to me as guys that were making those hustle plays. That Parker Stewart was an absolute menace on the defensive side. And I think that's one side of his game that maybe wasn't talked about a lot, but he was in guys' face. He was tipping balls. And then Jordan Geronimo also just making kind of the hustle plays at the end of the first half of the second game. Indiana had kind of weathered a little bit of a run from BC Mega, and they had the ball at the end of the half, and Jordan Geronimo has a little putback to give Indiana, I believe it was like a 7-point lead, but he got a rebound. It was just like a simple hustle play. And I think, especially in a league like the Big Ten, where it's going to be physical and you kind of have to like grit everything and, push your way for every little point, and that those can be extremely important. I think that those two guys maybe slipping under the radar a little bit could be huge for Indiana.
So we talked a little bit earlier about, I mentioned expectations, how that was kind of your big thing that came out of Media Day. So I want to actually talk to both of you about expectations for this Indiana team. As I mentioned earlier, I did my every year. Brendan Quinn of The Athletic does a official, unofficial media poll because the Big Ten in the preseason, I don't know why they do this, but for men's basketball, I think the same for women's, they don't actually survey the media to ask for their predicted order of finish on how the league's going to finish. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's they don't want to hurt Nebraska's fault that they get picked 13th every year or what it is, but so Brendan surveys media members from two media members from each, Brendan and Adam Jardy of the Columbus Dispatch, who Tyler knows both of these fine gentlemen well, but they survey two media members from each school to get the projected order of finish. That poll will come out next week in advance of Big Ten Media Day, which is going to be in Indianapolis. But I had to, I'm still in the process, I think, of submitting my ballot, but I kind of already showed my hand in the offseason when I did my offseason power rankings for the Big Ten, and I had Indiana 8th. And all these preseason magazines have come out, and Indiana's picked 7th. So I was kind of in the same ballpark. Grace, I'll start with you, and Tyler, chime in as well. I mean, based on, I'll tell you what my thinking on this was, and you can tell me if you agree, disagree, or if you have, a different opinion. I haven't seen Indiana make the NCAA tournament since 2016. We've had a lot of seasons in between then where every year we hear about, something has changed or, obviously there's a new coach, but even when Archie Miller came in, it was 4 seasons of, this or that and nothing really materialized. So I'm kind of at the point where Indiana needs to show me something before I'm going to be willing to say they're a top 5 team in the Big Ten. Where are you on Indiana entering the season in terms of the Big Ten? And I'm not asking you to give me like your full order of finish, but do you feel like that middle of the pack seems fair in the preseason, and then kind of just see where things go once the games start?
I totally agree with middle of the pack to start the season. You don't jump up that much. I mean, like you said, factors have changed, but factors have changed in the past, and you don't see that significant jump. And I think a lot of this excitement and a lot of these high expectations have come from the culture side of things. That's, Mike Woodson making appearances around town, bringing recruits around. I never, ever saw Archie Miller out and about. So that's obviously going to be something that when people see him and they see him bringing these kids around town, taking them out to Malibu Grill, all of that, they're obviously going to be excited. And I think that's something that might have falsely translated over to the court. And not saying that I don't think they're going to be talented. I think they're going to be a contender. I think they're going to do well. And but I think we need to start off with middle of the pack. I obviously think they're a step up from where they finished last season for sure, but there's so many of those aspects with tying back to tradition and history that have people feeling kind of back the way they did when Mike Woodson was on the team. And that's not the case. We need to really evaluate where we are as a team, and that's with all of that. And Mike has never coached in the college level before. He's coming from the NBA. So there's a lot of different factors, and bringing in those new faces and everything. I don't want to overestimate where I think this team is going to be. And I think middle of the pack is very fair, but yeah, I think if I'd have to guess where all these high expectations are coming from, it's definitely from a hype culture side of things and people not really looking at this team for what it is at surface level.
Yeah, going off of those expectations and kind of what I was talking about earlier, my biggest question is not, does Indiana finish 8th? Because I think preseason, that's a reasonable place. 7th, 8th is a reasonable place to put them. But are Indiana fans happy if Indiana finishes 7th or 8th? Because I think that in the back of a lot of people's minds, there's an optimism that maybe they could move up to 5th, maybe they could move up to 4th. I don't know. Looking at the Big Ten this season, I mean, Michigan is going to be really good. Michigan State's going to be really good. Purdue has some absolute studs coming back from last season. I think Jaden Ivey is going to be one of the best players in the country. Ohio State as well. You're looking at probably Wisconsin and Iowa taking steps back, but Rutgers probably will be good again with Geo Baker, and I know probably the most overrated player in the Big Ten, but Geo Baker and Ron Harper Jr. coming back. But going back to the chemistry bit, I think that is potentially what could kind of help Indiana and be different from last season. Because if you look at last season, with maybe, I think it was 5 games left, they were in the tournament. They only needed to win a couple of those last, I think it was 5 or 6 after they beat Minnesota. And that's where the chemistry aspect, I think, can play a factor, because you, at some point in the Big Ten season, Indiana is going to face adversity. Like, that's just inevitable. And having the chemistry piece to it, Trayce said this is his favorite team that he's been on. And he said there wasn't bad blood between anybody else, but this team was just different. There was that outing they had last weekend. I look at like a ranch or something, and Mike Woodson was throwing around the football with Khristian Lander. He made a nice catch too. Khristian Lander looks like he has a little arm on him. So, but Mike Woodson did a little touchdown dance and spiked the ball, and they were playing Jenga and ping pong. And I think that if you're comparing this year's and last year's team without watching them play, I think that chemistry aspect could be like a huge factor, because we saw last season when Indiana kind of got hit with some adversity, they didn't necessarily bounce back, especially in that last little 5 or 6 game stretch. So I think that when you look at how is the team going to finish expectations, I think the chemistry bit is definitely a promising sign of that.
Yeah, in terms of the Big Ten finish, I think 7th or 8th needs to be the floor, because the non-conference schedule is so underwhelming that if Indiana, say they do really good in non-conference and only lose 1 game or 2 games, it's 11 non-conference games. So let's say they win 9 non-conference games or 10. If they go into Big Ten play and they're 500 or less, that's not going to get it done in terms of getting back to the tournament. So I say 7th or 8th is kind of the baseline, but it also needs to be the floor. And I think one thing that people maybe are dismissing a little bit is just the depth of the teams in this league and how good many of them are. I mean, Tyler, you named a bunch of them. You didn't even name Maryland, and you didn't name Illinois. Illinois has arguably the best player maybe in the country coming back now with Kofi coming back to Champaign. he dominated Indiana in the paint when they've played. So, the teams that I'm looking at that Indiana's got to be better than if they want to get in that spot are Iowa, Wisconsin, and Rutgers. And Rutgers, a lot of people had a problem with me picking Indiana below Rutgers. Well, Indiana played Rutgers last season 3 times and they lost 3 times. And I know Rutgers lost some players. Miles Johnson transferred to UCLA. Jacob Young transferred out. But they do have a pretty good nucleus back, and they're a team that is difficult to play against. So leading into Big Ten Media Days next week, you guys will be in Indianapolis at what's the new arena? It was Bankers Life. Is it Gainbridge?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fit with the car theme of the city, I guess.
Okay. So next Thursday and Friday, Indiana will be talking on Friday. What are you looking forward to learning? Either of you, Tyler, you can start. Anything you're looking forward to learning at Big Ten Media Day other than what we just learned at it's like Indiana just had this media day, and so now we're going to be going back to Indianapolis and talking to a lot of these same people. There'll be some other teams there. Anything you're kind of curious to learn, just in general, from this event? You didn't have a chance to have it last year, so what are some of the things you'll be looking out for?
To be honest, I'm kind of excited to maybe talk to some players on the other team and coaches from the other team, because that's not really something I've had an opportunity to do. And while I've covered the team, they didn't have the media day last season, so I haven't really been in a setting where you have players and coaches from every Big Ten team there. So I'm just kind of looking forward to the atmosphere, I guess, kind of being in person. That's one of the things I really enjoyed about going to the Bahamas, is that just seeing the players and coaches interact on a closer level that you really don't get when you're covering the team, mostly remotely last season. So just being in that atmosphere and maybe talking to some players from other schools is probably what I'm most looking forward to.
I agree with Tyler. I mean, there's going to be a lot going on, which I think is going to be the exciting part of it all. And you have to go into it knowing that, you're not going to get everything you possibly can out of it, because there's so much. And like we talked about earlier, media days are really interesting because it's all this theme and tone for the entire season. And sometimes it kind of just goes out of the window right away. But if we can kind of get a look at these teams and these players and how they interact with their other coaches, it'll be really interesting. I don't know how much more we're going to learn from Indiana and Coach Woodson and whoever he decides to bring with him, but it'll be cool to see them in that setting, because I don't know if any. I mean, I don't remember who did they bring when they had it 2 years ago. Probably not Trayce. Did they bring Trayce?
No, they usually don't bring freshmen. So yeah, it'll be Trayce's first time, and for him being in Indianapolis, I'm sure it'll be fun. We only got a couple of minutes left here, so I'm gonna put you both on the spot here. I want to get your preseason projections for 2, kind of sticking with the theme of Big Ten Media Day. I want to get your prediction on who will win the Big Ten in the regular season. Just kind of some of the contenders, at least on paper, going in: Michigan, Purdue, Ohio State, Illinois, talked about a lot. And I also want to get your pick for Big Ten Player of the Year. That's another one that is interesting, because you've got Kofi, you've got obviously Trayce Jackson-Davis, EJ Liddell, Hunter Dickinson at Michigan. Tyler, you can go first. Give me your we'll get you out of here on this. Who's your pick to win the Big Ten this season? Who's your pick for Big Ten Player of the Year?
I know people aren't going to like this, but I think Purdue just has so many pieces. I mean, I think they're pretty much bringing back everybody. They have Trevion Williams back. Putting him with Zach Edey, if they put him like on the floor at the same time, that's just going to be ridiculous to try to guard. But Jaden Ivey too, I wasn't really impressed with him last season. And I mean, I think that Purdue, if they don't kind of fall apart like they did in the first game of the NCAA tournament, I think right now that they would be my pick to win it all, or win the Big Ten, should I say. And as far as Player of the Year, I think Hunter Dickinson probably right now for me. I think he just moves really well for his size. He's got a nice touch with his left hand. I think it's kind of the same questions with him as is with Trayce. Can he use his right hand and stretch the floor a little bit more? But I think, he was just dominant last season. So I think right now he's my Big Ten Player of the Year.
I'm going to go kind of along the same lines of Tyler, but with a team that also didn't perform out in the NCAA tournament, especially in the way they were supposed to. Illinois, I think, could win the Big Ten. I think that's going to be my pick this year. Just you got to have that vengeance coming out of the way that you lost in the tournament this last season. And returning Kofi is so huge. And I think that if there's any team that's going to come out and really want to get the job done, it's going to be them. And then I was also going to say Hunter Dickinson, just like Tyler. But you talked a little bit about Jaden Ivey, and I don't think he has what it takes yet to maybe, get around some of the bigger like TJDs, Hunter Dickinson's, Kofi's to get that Big Ten Player of the Year. But I think he'll give them a run for their money for sure.
Yeah, those are good picks. I got Michigan, so we'll have to see where that all shakes out. I think Grace might have a sleeper pick there on her hands with Illinois, because if Andre Curbelo is as good as people think he can be, I know they lost Io, but Trent Frazier, Curbelo, and Kofi is a really good nucleus. And I think a lot of the Big Ten also comes down to, I haven't looked at this as closely as I do sometimes in the offseason. A lot of it comes down to the schedule you play and which teams you have to play twice. So I haven't really looked at Michigan, Purdue, and Illinois and compared their schedules. And for Big Ten Player of the Year, I went with Kofi. I just think he's the most dominant player in the league. And I understand the argument, though, for Hunter Dickinson. I think EJ Liddell is a guy that really doesn't get talked about enough, too. He's very versatile and is capable of putting Ohio State on his shoulders. The Big Ten, there may not be that one dominant team this year. There's going to be several teams, I think, in the top 15, top 20 all season. There's maybe not that one team that's standing above the rest, but I think it's going to be a really fun season to watch, just kind of the parity, maybe those top 4 or 5 teams going back and forth. And I think whoever wins the league, it's going to be well-deserved. Tyler and Grace, thank you so much for joining us this week on Podcast on the Brink. I encourage everybody to follow both of these fine young students at IU on Twitter. Boost their Twitter follower count. They're both going to be stars in sports media for a long time, and we're just happy that we get to have them helping us this year with the coverage. Looking forward to having them being able to be at games this year. I think it's going to be a lot of fun having fans back and getting a chance to probably go to some road games as well. So we'll look forward to their coverage all season on Inside the Hall. As I said, give them a follow on Twitter. As for Podcast on the Brink, thanks everybody for listening. We will be back soon with another episode. Like I said, we'll try to get back more on a regular schedule, doing a weekly episode from here on out. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.